Please close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember a specific sound from your childhood. Perhaps it is the sharp, deafening bang of a street popcorn maker echoing through a narrow alleyway. Or maybe it is the distinct, rhythmic clacking of a heavy sewing machine late at night. Today we are taking a journey back in time. We are going to explore 20 everyday objects that defined life in China during the 1970s and 1980s. These are the things we grew up with, the items we touched, smelled, and relied upon every single day. If you lived through those days, these memories are etched into your soul. Stay with me until the very end, because the final object we will talk about is quietly sitting in your home right now, holding the most precious pieces of your entire life. Life in China during the 1970s and 1980s moved at a completely different pace. Time felt slower, thicker, and deeply rooted in the physical world around us. Today we are surrounded by smartphones, instant deliveries, and endless digital noise. People often say we were poorer back then because we had fewer things. But were we really? Without screens to stare at, we looked at each other. Without instant messaging, we valued the long anticipation of a handwritten letter. The communal courtyards and narrow alleyways were alive with constant, genuine human connection. We shared our food, our tools, and our daily struggles. The objects we owned were not disposable. They were cherished, repaired, and passed down. They required our patience and our physical effort. In many ways, the lack of modern conveniences meant our lives were actually much richer in sincerity and emotional depth. Let us remember the things that grounded us, the tools that shaped our days, and the simple beauty of a life lived face to face. Let us begin with the heavy, cold steel of a flying pigeon or phoenix bicycle. If you lived in the 1980s, you know this was not just a way to get around. It was a prized possession, often polished on Sunday mornings, until the chrome handlebars shone like mirrors. Do you remember the feeling of sitting on the crossbar in the front while your father pedaled, the chilly morning wind rushing against your face? Your mother would sit sideways on the back rack, perhaps holding a mesh bag of fresh vegetables from the morning market. The rhythmic clicking of the chain and the sharp trill of the bell clearing the way through a sea of blue and gray cotton jackets was the soundtrack of the morning commute. Owning one of these required saving up for months, and once you finally had it, it became a part of the family. We would knit little covers for the saddle to keep the dust off, and carefully oil the gears so it would last a lifetime. Sometimes a flat tire meant walking for miles, pushing the heavy iron frame, but no one complained. We just enjoyed the slow walk home, listening to the hum of the city. These bicycles carried the weight of our daily lives, our hopes, and our humble routines. Today, streets are filled with silent, fast electric scooters, but they will never replace the profound sense of pride we felt when we first learned to balance on those heavy black wheels, feeling like we could ride all the way to the edge of the world. Let us move from the streets into the home, where an enamel mug always sat proudly on the wooden table. These were not delicate porcelain cups. They were sturdy, heavy, and painted in cream color with bright red slogans or large peony flowers. Do you remember the rough texture of the chipped edges, where the black iron peeked through the white enamel? Every time you took a sip of hot boiled water, your lips would find that familiar chip. They were used by factory workers, teachers, and grandfathers reading the morning paper. The inside was often stained a deep, earthy brown from years of brewing loose green tea leaves, a patina that no one ever dared to scrub away because it held the flavor of 1,000 quiet afternoons. The handle would get incredibly hot, so you had to hold it delicately by the very edge. Dropping it on the concrete floor produced a loud, echoing clang, but it never shattered. It merely gained another dent, another scar, another story. These mugs witnessed our late-night studies, our family gatherings, and our quiet moments of reflection. They were virtually indestructible, much like the resilient spirit of the people who drank from them during those simpler, yet highly demanding decades. Now think about where that hot water came from. In the corner of the room stood the towering double happiness thermos. Its outer shell was made of thin metal, painted in vibrant shades of red and pink, always decorated with blooming flowers or two mandarin ducks swimming together, symbolizing everlasting love. The real magic, however, was the fragile silvered glass liner inside and the soft wooden cork that sealed the top. Do you recall the slightly damp, earthy smell of that cork when you pulled it out? Pouring water was a delicate ritual. The steaming liquid would hiss as it hit the cold cup, warming your hands on a freezing winter morning. In the 1970s and 80s, boiling water was not instant. We would take these heavy thermoses to the neighborhood boiler room, waiting in line, exchanging neighborhood gossip while the steam clouded our vision. The deep rumbling sound of the water filling the glass vacuum tube changed pitch as it reached the top, a perfect acoustic warning that it was full. It was a communal chore, a daily rhythm that connected the entire street. When a glass liner inevitably broke with a terrifying, muffled implosion, it was a genuine tragedy, quickly followed by a trip to the local supply store to carefully carry a fragile new liner back home. As we sit in the warmth of the room, another familiar sound might come to mind. The rhythmic, soothing clack, clack, clack of the Flying Man or Butterfly brand sewing machine. This was the centerpiece of the household, a symbol of diligence and love. It was a heavy cast-iron beast mounted on a wooden table, powered entirely by the steady pumping of your mother's foot on the wide iron treadle. Do you remember watching the silver needle blur into a solid line, fascinated by how a simple spool of cotton thread could bind pieces of fabric together? In those days, clothes were not thrown away. Knees of trousers were patched, collars of shirts were turned, and when the Lunar New Year approached, the sewing machine worked late into the night. The smell of machine oil mixed with the scent of fresh, stiff cotton cloth is a fragrance that instantly transports us back to childhood. We would sit on the floor, collecting the discarded scraps of fabric, imagining them as tiny blankets for our toys. The sewing machine was more than a tool. It was a mother's silent way of wrapping her family in warmth and dignity, stitch by careful stitch, ensuring we looked our absolute best even when times were incredibly tough and resources were scarce. And what would the Lunar New Year be without the sweet reward of White Rabbit creamy candy? For a child growing up in the 1980s, this was the ultimate luxury. A small cylinder of pure joy wrapped in iconic blue, white, and red paper. Unfolding it was a delicate ritual. Inside the paper lay the candy, wrapped in a thin, translucent layer of edible rice paper. Do you remember the sheer delight of letting that rice paper dissolve on your tongue before your teeth even touched the chewy, milky center? The candy itself was incredibly tough at first, requiring patience and a strong jaw. But as it warmed in your mouth, it released a rich, sweet, dairy flavor that felt incredibly opulent. We would save the wrappers, flattening them out and keeping them in the pages of our school books like precious bookmarks. These candies were not everyday treats. They were doled out sparingly, a reward for good grades or a gift from visiting relatives. The lingering sweetness of the White Rabbit candy was the taste of celebration, a fleeting moment of childhood bliss that we savored slowly, knowing it would be a long time before we might be lucky enough to taste it again. Let us take a moment to look inside a worn leather wallet from that era. Before the economic reforms fully took hold, cash alone was not enough to buy what you needed. You also needed ration coupons. Do you recall the tiny, incredibly thin slips of paper, printed with intricate borders and faded ink? There were considerations for grain, for cooking oil, for cotton cloth, and even for meat. Handling them required immense care. They were thinner than a butterfly's wing and just as fragile. The anxiety of losing a grain coupon was palpable, for it meant going without rice or steamed buns. We remember watching our parents carefully counting these slips under the dim light of a low-wattage bulb, planning the family's meals for the entire month. Going to the grain store was an event. The heavy scent of raw rice and flour filled the air, and the store clerk would expertly slide the abacus beads with a loud clacking sound before stamping the coupons. These tiny pieces of paper dictated the boundaries of our daily lives, teaching us the profound value of every single grain of rice and every inch of fabric. They are obsolete now, a relic of a planned economy, but they remain a powerful symbol of our parents' careful management and survival. As the 1980s progressed, a new sound entered our homes, brought in by the bulky, rectangular cassette recorder. Often a red lantern or a smuggled Sharp brand, this heavy plastic box with its silver buttons and gleaming handle was a window to the outside world. Do you remember the sharp click of the play button being pressed down? Suddenly the room would be filled with the gentle, melancholic voice of Teresa Teng, her sweet melodies floating through the air despite the slight hiss of the magnetic tape. We would sit on the floor, mesmerized by the two small wheels spinning inside the clear plastic window. When the tape inevitably got tangled, the panic would set in. We would carefully pull out the crinkled brown ribbon and use a yellow hexagonal pencil to wind it painstakingly back into the cassette. We recorded our own voices, pressing play and record simultaneously, laughing at how strange we sounded. This machine brought music into our private spaces, allowing us to dream, to sing along, and to feel a sense of romance and longing that was entirely new to our generation. The cassette recorder was not just an electronic device. It was our very first taste of personal freedom and cultural awakening. When it was time to leave the house for school, we slung a green canvas satchel across our chests. This was not a modern ergonomic backpack. It was a simple, sturdy bag, dyed in a deep olive green, usually adorned with a bright red five-pointed star, or the words, "Serve the People," printed in bold characters. Do you remember the rough, durable feel of the canvas and the distinct smell of the dye, especially when it got wet in the rain? The strap would dig slightly into your shoulder, but you carried it with immense pride. Inside, there were no fancy tablets or colorful binders, just a few thin notebooks, a pencil box that clattered with every step, and perhaps a small, cold-steamed bun for a midday snack. Over the years, the green color would fade to a dusty, yellowish gray, and holes would appear at the corners, which our mothers would painstakingly mend with thick thread. That satchel swung against our hips as we ran through the narrow alleyways, chasing our friends, completely oblivious to the weight of the world. It was a symbol of equality. Every child, regardless of their family background, carried the exact same green bag, sharing the exact same simple dreams of the future. And on our feet, we wore the ubiquitous Liberation shoes. These were simple rubber-soled sneakers with green canvas uppers, originally designed for soldiers but embraced by the entire nation. Do you remember the incredibly strong, pungent smell of the rubber when they were brand new? They offered absolutely no arch support, and in the freezing winters the cold would seep right through the thin canvas, chilling our toes to the bone. Yet they were the most versatile shoes in the world. We ran through muddy fields, climbed trees, and played endless games of jump rope in them. When they got dirty, which was every single day, we would scrub them with a stiff brush and leave them out in the sun to dry, the wet canvas turning a dark, rich green. The rubber sole was tough, but eventually, after miles of walking and running, the heel would wear down completely flat. Wearing a new pair of liberation shoes on the first day of school made you feel like you could run faster and jump higher than anyone else. They were the humble foundation of our youth, grounding us to the dusty earth of a country that was just beginning to find its modern footing. Let us wander out into the communal courtyard, the heart of neighborhood life. Here the wooden washboard reigned supreme. Before the luxury of washing machines, every Sunday was laundry day, accompanied by the rhythmic, percussive sound of wet fabric being rubbed against grooved wood. Do you remember the rough, splintery texture of the board and the harsh, alkaline smell of the solid bars of laundry soap? In the dead of winter, our mothers would plunge their hands into icy water, their skin turning red and raw, to scrub the heavy cotton jackets and muddy trousers. The washboard was usually propped up in a large galvanized metal tub, and the soapy water would splash onto the concrete ground. It was hard, back-breaking labor, but it was also a time for socializing. Neighbors would wash their clothes side by side, exchanging stories, complaining about the price of cabbage, and keeping an eye on the children playing nearby. The wooden washboard was an instrument of endless toil, yet it produced the incredibly comforting scent of sun-dried laundry, stiff and fresh, folded lovingly at the end of a long day. It represents the quiet, uncomplaining sacrifice of the women who held our families together. Suddenly a loud, deafening bang echoes through the alleyway, followed by a cloud of thick, white steam. You do not need to look to know what it is. Your nose already catches the intensely sweet, toasted aroma of popcorn, mixed with the faint metallic scent of the coal fire. The traveling popcorn maker had arrived. He sat on a small wooden stool, slowly cranking the handle of a soot-blackened, pressure cooker-like cannon over a small flame. Do you remember the mixture of absolute terror and thrilling anticipation as you stood a few meters away, covering your ears tightly with your hands? We would bring our own small bowls of raw corn kernels or rice, along with a tiny packet of saccharin, and wait for our turn. When the pressure was just right, he would place a long canvas sack over the nozzle and pull the lever. The explosion was magnificent. What came out was a magical transformation. Tiny hard seeds turned into massive, fluffy clouds of sweetness. We would scoop the warm, sticky treats into our bags, our hands getting dirty from the soot, eating them immediately while they were still hot. It was a spectacular performance, a sensory feast that cost only a few coins, but delivered immeasurable joy. As evening approached, a new focal point emerged in the neighborhood: the black and white television set. In the early 1980s, owning a television was a rare and prestigious thing. It was usually a heavy wooden box with a small curved glass screen, perhaps a Beijing or Panda brand. Do you remember the elaborate ritual of setting it up? The antenna had to be adjusted with painstaking precision to banish the snowy static and capture a clear image. When a popular show, like the legendary martial arts drama The Legend of the Condor Heroes, was broadcast, the television was brought out into the open courtyard. Dozens of neighbors would gather, bringing their own bamboo stools, cracking sunflower seeds, and sitting in the warm evening air. The flickering blue-white light illuminated the faces of young and old alike, all completely captivated by the grainy images on the tiny screen. There was no remote control. Changing the channel required turning a heavy, clunking dial. We did not mind the poor reception or the lack of color. What mattered was the shared experience, the collective gasps and laughter, sitting shoulder to shoulder with people who felt more like extended family than mere neighbors. With the arrival of winter, the smell of the air changed completely, dominated by the sharp, slightly acrid scent of honeycomb coal. The iron coil stove, known to us as Feng Wo Mei, was the lifeline of the household, providing both heat and a way to cook. Do you remember the sight of those black cylindrical coal briquettes, perfectly pierced with holes to let the air flow through? Starting the fire in the early freezing morning was a delicate art, involving old newspapers, small twigs, and a lot of blowing until the coal finally caught and glowed a beautiful, menacing orange. The stove usually sat in the hallway or outside the door, and the sound of a bubbling pot of cabbage and tofu stew simmering on top of it was the sound of winter comfort. But we also remember the subtle, underlying fear of carbon monoxide. Windows had to be left slightly open, letting in the biting cold just to keep us safe while we slept. Handling the coal left our hands perpetually stained with fine black dust, and carrying the heavy tongs to carefully stack the burning briquettes was a daily chore. The honeycomb stove was dirty and demanding, but it provided a fierce, concentrated warmth that we gathered around like a glowing, life-saving beacon. When summer returned, the relentless heat brought out a different set of tools. Before electric fans and air conditioners became common, the woven bamboo fan, or pukui shan, was our only defense against the stifling humidity. Shaped like a large heart and bound with strips of fabric around the edges, these fans were everywhere. Do you remember the dry, rustling sound they made as old men, sitting in the shade of a large scholar tree, vigorously waved them back and forth? The fan smelled faintly of dried grass and old wood. Grandmothers would sit by our beds on sweltering nights, gently fanning us to sleep, the rhythmic breeze keeping the ferocious mosquitoes at bay. Over time, the edges of the fan would fray, and the handle would become dark and polished from the sweat and oils of thousands of hours of use. We would sometimes use them as breeches sunshades, or even as playful weapons in our childhood games. The bamboo fan required physical effort to create a breeze, a constant, repetitive motion that matched the slow, unhurried pace of summer afternoons. It was a tool of patience, cooling us down one gentle wave at a time. Morning in the 1980s had a very specific flavor, and it began at the bustling breakfast stall at the corner of the street. Do you remember waking up early and being sent out with an empty, dented aluminum pot in your hands? Your mission was to buy fresh soy milk and golden, crispy youtiao, the deep-fried dough sticks. The stall was always enveloped in a cloud of white steam and the rich, heavy smell of hot peanut oil. The vendor, armed with massive wooden chopsticks, expertly flipped the long strips of dough in the giant iron wok. The sound of the dough sizzling and puffing up in the blistering oil was incredibly appetizing. You would hand over your small change and perhaps a grain coupon, and the vendor would ladle the steaming, slightly smoky soy milk directly into your pot. Walking back home, the pot radiating heat against your leg, you would secretly tear off a small, crunchy piece of the youtiao and eat it on the way. Dipping that crispy, airy dough into the sweet, warm soy milk at the family table was the ultimate comfort. A simple but deeply satisfying ritual that fueled us for the long day ahead. To survive the mosquito-heavy summers, every household relied on a tall, elegant green glass bottle of Florida water, known to us as Hua Lu Shui. Often from the Peony brand, this magical liquid was an essential part of our hygiene and comfort. Do you remember the intense, sharp, cooling fragrance? It was a potent blend of mint, menthol, and floral extracts that could instantly clear your sinuses. When you were bitten by a mosquito, your mother would dab a few drops onto the itchy red bump, and the intense, burning coolness provided immediate relief. But its uses went far beyond bug bites. After a hot, sticky day, a few drops of Florida water added to a basin of bath water transformed a simple wash into a luxurious, refreshing spa experience. The lingering scent of Hua Lu Shui on clean cotton clothes is the unmistakable aroma of a Chinese summer in the 80s. The heavy glass bottle, with its ornate vintage label, looked almost like a magic potion on the wooden dresser. Even today, catching a faint whiff of that distinct minty floral perfume instantly teleports us back to those long, humid evenings, sitting under the stars and feeling perfectly protected and cared for. In the quiet of the night, when the city finally slept, the only sound in the room was the loud, relentless ticking of the mechanical twin-bell alarm clock. Usually made by the Shanghai or Diamond brand, this heavy piece of metal machinery sat proudly on the nightstand. Do you remember the solid, weighty feel of it when you picked it up to wind the mainspring every single evening? The winding key offered a satisfying, grinding resistance that let you know the clock was storing up energy. The face of the clock often featured glow-in-the-dark hands, painted with a pale green phosphorus that offered a faint, eerie light in the pitch-black room. But the most memorable aspect was, of course, the alarm itself. When it went off at 6 in the morning, the small hammer would strike the twin metal bells with a violent, heart-stopping clatter that could wake the entire house. There was no snooze button. You simply had to slam your hand down on the top button to silence the terrifying noise. It was a demanding, unforgiving timekeeper, an object that taught us discipline and punctuality in an era when every minute of daylight was precious. Before video games and plastic toys flooded the market, our entertainment was found in the dirt and dust of the alleyways. For the boys, it was glass marbles or danju. Do you remember the satisfying, heavy clink of the marbles in your pockets? We would draw circles in the dry earth and spend hours flicking our beautifully swirled glass spheres, trying to knock our opponents out of the ring. Our knees were always covered in dirt, and our thumbnails grew tough from the repeated flicking. For the girls, and many boys too, the game of choice was throwing homemade sandbags, or shabao. These were carefully sewn by our grandmothers out of colorful scraps of leftover fabric, stuffed tightly with rice or fine sand. The satisfying impact of a heavy sandbag hitting your shoulder during a game of dodgeball was a badge of honor. These toys cost absolutely nothing, made from discarded materials or bought for pennies, yet they provided endless hours of fierce competition and pure, unfiltered joy. They taught us hand-eye coordination, fairness, and the simple pleasure of playing outside until our mothers called us home for dinner. Every morning began, and every evening ended, with the metal enamel wash basin. Much like the mug, this basin was a staple of domestic life, but on a grander scale. It was wide and shallow, typically painted in a bright, joyous red, with a massive illustration of two plump carp swimming among lotus flowers at the bottom, symbolizing abundance and good fortune. Do you remember the deafening, metallic crash it made if it accidentally slipped from your wet hands and hit the floor? The paint would chip away over the years, revealing the black iron beneath, creating jagged spots that rust eventually claimed. We used it for everything, washing our faces with cold water in the morning, soaking our tired feet in steaming water before bed, and even giving the newest baby in the family a bath. The sound of water splashing against the tinny sides of the basin echoed through the thin walls of our homes. A brand new, perfectly pristine wash basin was a standard wedding gift, bright and full of promise, and watching it slowly become chipped and faded was like watching the marriage itself settle into a comfortable, enduring, and resilient companionship. Finally, let us turn to the most precious object of all, safely tucked away in the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet, the family photo album. These were heavy, thick books with covers made of imitation leather. Do you remember the unique, dry smell of the heavy black cardboard pages and the crinkle of the delicate, translucent glassine paper that separated them? There was no digital scrolling. Every single photograph was a rare and treasured physical object. The black and white photos with their scalloped edges were held in place by tiny triangular corner stickers. Sometimes a special portrait was painstakingly hand-tinted, with faint pinks on the cheeks and light blues on the clothes. Turning the pages was a quiet, almost sacred ritual. You had to be careful not to tear the thin, protective sheets. We would trace the faces of our grandparents when they were young and laugh at our own awkward haircuts. These albums were the physical archives of our existence. They held our history, our losses, and our happiest moments, bound together in silence. Looking at them now, we realize that the most beautiful thing about those photos is not how perfect we looked, but how genuinely present we were in those fleeting, irreplaceable moments. As we close this chapter of our memories, we come to realize a profound truth. We do not just miss the heavy bicycles, the rusted enamel mugs, or the sweet taste of a rare candy. We miss the people we were when we held those things. We miss the vibrant youth in our parents' faces, the unbreakable bonds of our old neighborhoods, and the beautiful simplicity of a world that moved at a human pace. The objects are fading, but the warmth they brought to our lives remains untouchable. If this journey back in time brought a smile to your face or a tear to your eye, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to help keep these memories alive. But before you go, I want to hear from you. Which of these 20 objects brought back the strongest, most vivid memory for you? And what is the story behind it? Please share your personal history in the comments below, so we can all remember together.